from Anshe Sfard Bethel Emeth Congregation. It's time to take 10 minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein.
Welcome to our discussion of Pesach, our own worst enemy. If we ask ourselves a question, who is the villain of the story of Pesach? Of course, most people would say it's Paro. If we look more carefully, there are a number of other villains in our story as well. As we've pointed out on other occasions, the story of the Haggadah is actually told no less than 4 times throughout the Haggadah. 4, a very important number for Pesach, 4 cups, 4 sons, 4 questions, and 4 stories. What are the 4 stories, and who is the villain in each story? First story is the most famous of all, Avadim Hayinu LeFaro b'Mitzrayim, that we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Paro is, of course, the first villain. Second story told in Haggadah is Mitchila Avdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu. In the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. Who was the first idol worshiper? The most notorious one of our ancestors who was an idol worshiper? Terach, father of Abraham. Idol maker, idol salesman, Terach. However, by implication, in this second story, it was actually us. It was we, as we were the idol worshippers. We, in the sense that it's our ancestors. And also, if we look in the book of Yechezkel, we know that the Jewish people did worship idols in Egypt. We know this also from chapter 16 in Yechezkel. It's mentioned in the Haggadah later on during the 4th story of the Laban story. It's mentioned the verse in Yechezkel that we were naked. The rabbis say naked of mitzvot. We were naked of good deeds and merit because we had worshipped idols. So the villain of the second story is Terach, and the villain is us. We are the villain of the second story as well. The third story is a story that God told Abraham that we would be slaves for 400 years and then go out with great wealth. In that story, who's the villain? Why were we going to be afflicted by a nation for 400 years? Well, it's the nation's fault. But the rabbis ask, well, why would God tell Abraham this terrible news that his children will be slaves for 400 years? What did Abraham do to deserve this? And they give 2 answers. One is that he asked too many questions. He said, Bama Eda, how do I know that I'm going to inherit the land? After all, I don't have any children. And the rabbis say, Bameh, in the Atbash, in a certain numerology, using the first letter and the last letter of the alphabet, and the second with the second to last letter, etc., it turns out Bameh spells Shin Yud Samach, Yud Tzadi, 310 and 90, equaling 400. This question of how do I know? Bameh Eda leads to the 400 years in slavery. Abraham is the villain of the third story. Another theory offered by the Ramban is that when there was a famine in the land, Abraham had just come to the land, God told him to go to the land. There was a famine. What did he do? He went down to Egypt. And because of that, we went down to Egypt. Abraham is, strangely, and I hate to say it, the villain of the third story. The fourth story is the story of Laban, the Aramean, who tried to destroy my father, just tried to destroy Jacob and his family. Lavan, is the villain of the fourth story. However, there is, just as there are 4 cups, but there's a 5th cup as well for Elijah, so too there are 4 stories, but there's another story that's hidden in the Haggadah, the story of Joseph. We know that we wouldn't have been in Egypt if not for the sale of Joseph down to Egypt. And therefore, many rabbis have pointed out, Rabbi Shlomo Kluger and others, that Yosef is hiding in the story. Why, after all, asked the Jerusalem Talmud, the Medrash, why are there 4 cups? 4 cups, because it reminds us of the 4 cups in the butler's dream as he spoke to Joseph. Why do we have karpas and we dip it? Because we dip it to remember the sin of the brothers who dipped the coat of Joseph in blood. There is an allusion to the story of Joseph and the culpability of the brothers. The brothers of Joseph are the 5th villain of our story. So if we ask ourselves, how do we get into this mess? How do we land up being slaves in Egypt? What are we doing there? Aren't we from Canaan? Aren't we from Aram? The answer is that Paro enslaved us. The answer is that it was a punishment perhaps for Terach and for ourselves who worshipped idols. The answer is perhaps Abraham shouldn't have spoken in the way that he did. Perhaps he shouldn't have gone to Egypt as he did. The answer is that Laban was no good, and he created strife by creating this dual marriage, Leah and Rachel, and created the descent between the various brothers. And the answer is that we sold Joseph down to slavery, and that's how we got into this trouble. So we ask ourselves, whom do we have to blame for this terrible episode of this slavery in Egypt? Well, the answer is, b'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chalotenu. In every generation, there are those who try to destroy us. It's the bad guys. It's Laban. It's Paro. It's Terach. It's the people from the outside. But then we remind ourselves that the enemy is also within. That within each one of us, there is something that keeps us stuck in our own personal Egypts. Sometimes it's the brothers of Joseph. It's hatred. It's jealousy. Sometimes it's Abraham, it's theological questions, it's making the wrong decision in our lives. Sometimes we are our worst enemies. As we look at the holiday of Pesach and we try to get out of Egypt in every generation, we need to remember it's not only that we need to have victory over our various enemies, and there are so many in each generation and in this generation as well. This is no exception. We also have to save ourselves, from some of our bad decisions that we make, from some of our doubts and elements of faith, doubts in our faith. And also, we have to remember the way we act, one Jew toward another, one human being toward another. And these types of behaviors, positive and negative, will determine whether we can indeed get out of Egypt again. Thank you for joining us here at the Anshe Sfard Bethel Emet congregation here in Memphis, Tennessee, for our discussion of Pesach. Wish everyone a happy Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a happy Pesach, and a kosher Pesach as well. And for further discussions, please see our previous videos. Thanks to Jason Lefkowitz for his technical support today as well. Thank you.
This has been 10 Minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein. To learn more, visit ASBEE.org.